Hello everyone, and welcome to Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy. These are our weekly live conversations between myself, Valentina, Head of Insights and Insights and Impact at Elite Mind Academy. And we usually have our CEO and founder, Evelina, here, but today we are joined by our special expert guest, Steven Hayward, who is an attachment-focused sex and relationships psychotherapist. Today, we will be discussing the topic of attachment, which we often normally think about in terms of our intimate or romantic relationships, but we're going to actually be looking at that through the organizational well-being lens. So on our weekly live discussions, we usually look at topics that can stay behind closed doors in the organizational well-being industry, and this is one of them. So Steven, you are an expert in attachment and kind of relationships. And I wonder what are your first thoughts when we talk about attachment styles in the context of working relationships?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me as well, because this feels like such an important topic, because we spend what 50 years in paid employment, something like that, and my experience and the experience of so many people I know is that much of that isn't, well, sometimes we struggle. Much of that isn't very enjoyable, and of course this is fundamentally about how we relate to the people we work with, right? And maybe even how we relate to our organization. So I think a good place to start, Valentina, is with as you alluded to, which is when people hear about the word attachment, I think we often jump to, this is how two people in a romantic relationship relate to each other. But it's far wider than that. And at bottom, this is how attachment really is about how we relate to ourselves and our inner experience, our inner world. And then after that, it's how we then relate to our environment. And of course, our environment is the other. But actually, it's dogs and cats and people and everything else, right? So when we think about attachment and we go through this conversation, it would be helpful to hold in mind that this really lays the foundation for how we relate internally and then how we relate externally.
Absolutely. And I think this is kind of a useful point as well to mention. Anyone, please do ask questions in the chat. Please do comment and ask questions. This is a golden opportunity to ask all of your kind of relationship and attachment focused questions to an expert. And so we've kind of just started really answering this question, what are attachment styles? And you say it's about our relationship with ourselves, but our relationship with our environment. And kind of, I think that's a really useful way to frame it so that we can get outside of this box of just thinking, oh, it's only to do with how we operate in intimate relationships in our lives. And so would you kind of be able to give our listeners and our watchers a bit of a summary around attachment styles, what they are and the kind of common traits that we might see?
Yeah, that's a great question. And attachment, I guess, like any other theory or system, is that it's evolved, and there are through observation of watching how very young infants interact with their mothers, which is really how it started. Those early psychoanalysts and psychologists noticed that there weren't 100 ways that happened, and actually they boiled it down to a few different camps of how children relate to their mothers. And so the evolution of attachment has now become, well, perhaps that has an impact on how we relate as adults to each other too. And so primarily there are four. We usually think of four different attachment styles. Styles is a bit of an odd word, isn't it? But we're talking about maybe patterns or traits. But it's also important to mention right up front when we talk about styles, is that this isn't a box that you exist in. Styles are far more fluid than that, and often how we relate to our environment, which we might think we fit into a particular attachment box, but that's much more fluid. And depending on who we're talking to or who we're in relationship with, we can often move in and out of different attachment patterns. And So the four are the one we hope for everybody is that people are secure in their attachment. That's a secure relationship with myself, i.e., I know myself, I find myself trustworthy, and I have a good relationship internally. But also, I feel very safe, and I in my environment, and I generally think well, and I trust other people. So another good word for attachment at this point is safety. A lot of attachment is about how safe we feel, and whether we feel safe in our environment, whether we feel safe in relationship with other people. And then we have three insecure attachment types. One we often refer to as being anxious. And we often use the word anxious really when we're talking about infant attachment. In adult attachment, often we would use the word preoccupied. And the next one we would say that is the avoidant position. This is the one I think most people know about. I don't know why. It seems I hear the word avoidant frequently, so it's often called anxious avoidant in the infant. In the adult, we generally refer to them as perhaps being avoidant or dismissive in their attachment. And the fourth one, which is the one we really hope for nobody, which is the fearful position, sometimes called disorganized. But I would also put another word in there, which is I would put maybe unresolved trauma into that box as well. And maybe this might also be a good point. I'm sure this is way off topic for our conversation, but I would also put a little caveat, a little star in there to say to just mention neurodiversity, because it's very, very easy, right, when we're talking about things like autism or ADHD, to misdiagnose people. And often people with autism or ADHD may be misdiagnosed as having avoidant attachment, for example, and they're not the same thing. So just put a little star in there, because I think most therapists, me included, will tell you we're not that hot, or not in favour that much of diagnosing or labelling people. So that's another good thing when we think about attachment. Someone may appear to be fairly avoidant in their attachment, but I would be slow to say you are an avoidant person.
I think that's a really good point, Stephen, because kind of like with many things, and actually lots of labels that we use and see and hear commonly, there can be kind of too much of a blurry boundary, I think, between kind of recognizing certain traits in someone and then labeling the whole person as that trait. And that's kind of, as you're mentioning, can often come up with things like attachment styles and actually also even traits around neurodiversity. And when kind of people can use the words, oh, I'm feeling a bit ADHD, or she was being a bit autistic. And actually, that's, it's so far from the truth of the complexity actually of those neurodiverse conditions, and all the kind of sheer diversity of traits that fall under those umbrellas, when actually we're kind of just looking at the presentation of one particular trait at one particular time in that particular circumstance. So kind of, you mentioned a little bit around kind of early experiences and also trauma potentially affecting the way that we attach. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, kind of the kinds of things and the kinds of experiences that might be influencing our attachment styles or types.
Yeah. Well, I've got a lot of thoughts on that, and which is why I'm hesitating. So we can't ignore, of course, our very early experience of life. Those first few years, well, really starting in utero, really, our experience of being inside our mother can either be very stressful, or it can be relatively peaceful and calm and secure. Well, actually, now I think about it, I'd go a step further than that. I would say, well, we can't ignore the biology too. That's an area, I think, in certainly in psychotherapy and perhaps in neuroscience too, that we still don't know too much about. We know that biology has an impact on temperament, for example, but we don't really know the relationship between temperament and later attachment, for example. But so we can't ignore the biology. That's a growing field. But then we have our experience in utero, and we now know, for example, this is fairly recent. We now know that stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, they cross the placenta into the infant, and the infant's nervous system isn't mature enough to deal with that, and so we have people who are born in a sense, what should we say, primed for anxiety, and so we can't ignore that part either. And then, of course, we know that anxious parents breed anxious children, but of course, a large part of attachment is the first 7 years, which are probably the most important. And the first 2 years are primarily the mother is attached to the child is attached to the mother, we hope. Then dad comes online a little bit later, around 18 months or 2 years. But the biggest part, I think, of what influences our attachment is our relationship to those multiple adult caregivers very early on, and whether those relationships are supportive and consistent and attentive. These are the qualities we look for from caregivers. And if there are stresses, if there are attachment injuries, these things leave a lasting influence on our blueprint, if you like.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're kind of in those early stages, and I suppose kind of thinking actually just about the biology, it can become a bit of a snowball effect as well. So kind of if we're primed for anxiety and kind of stress and difficulty in those ways physiologically, then that may make us more kind of sensitive or reactive to kind of difficulties in attachment that we experience in our early lives as well. And kind of I wonder with that, from your experience, would you say that there's kind of, what's the capacity for somebody's attachment style to change over time? And kind of mentioned that in different contexts we might experience different attachment traits, but when we kind of have these maybe even biological predispositions and these kind of very formative early experiences, how would you say those can or can't change over time?
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably the very best news about attachment, is that actually the attachment, or secure attachment, can be learned. That's the best news about attachment, is that these aren't fixed positions, which is why I started out by saying, let's refrain from putting somebody in a box and saying this is who they are in their entirety, because we know that good relationships with secure people, a therapist, or maybe you're fortunate enough to marry you have a secure spouse, or maybe you've got supportive people in your life. This is what changes our attachment. Being in relationship with people who are consistent and people who are supportive and secure. And it takes a while perhaps, but this is what changes our attachment, is our nervous system learning that actually the world is a safe place and I can rely on other people. And it turns out people can rely on me too. And this is about that dance we do between whether I can ask for my needs to be met, and whether I'm happy for other people to ask me to meet their needs, and how do we care for each other, and how do I ask for care. Our experience of all of that is what changes our perception of ourselves and our environment. So it's always about how we connect with other people and the types of people that we connect with. It's not much of a thought experiment, I guess, to imagine an anxious person only in relationship with other anxious people, right? We can imagine what that would be like, or maybe an avoidant person who would generally withdraw and seek isolation. Imagine a person like that who's only with other people who are like that. So how the types of people we are in relationship with has a massive influence on how our attachments evolve.
I think that's a really, really important thing to remember, and also very empowering kind of for anybody who maybe kind of wondering how how to address things that they might be recognizing in themselves. And so kind of thinking about those early relationships, I wonder kind of, I think our friendships are a really important kind of practice ground for a lot of these attachment traits. And, you know, when we are forming bonds and relationships with other children, you know, that's where we're kind of experiencing those attachment dynamics for the first time outside of our family and outside of those kind of primary caregiver roles. And I think that's where those can be incredibly influential in perhaps counteracting kind of insecure attachment traits early on, and doing that kind of re-education around what secure relationships can feel like, and that building that trust in others and kind of our environments, and that sense of safety. And so I would also kind of encourage that, not just through childhood, but as we become more self-aware and we're adults and we kind of have more autonomy over our relationships with others, to start to notice your relationships with your friends as well, and what they're like, and what those people in your life tend to model in terms of attachment traits. And it's not to say don't ever be friends with people who have insecure attachment traits, but to be aware of how that might be influencing you, and in general to kind of try and have a bit of a mixture in your life. I always think is most useful, because you end up with greater awareness and empathy for the experiences of others. You learn how to, because we won't always encounter people who have secure attachment types or the same attachment.
Definitely not
ourselves. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we also, as well as learning how to recognize our own attachment traits, we also need to learn, I think, to recognize the attachment traits of others and understand what they need to then help create that secure bond, and that kind of develop that sense of safety and security in them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you mentioned there is spot on, because actually awareness is everything, isn't it? And as we become aware of why do I relate in the way that I relate, and having that awareness of our own internal process, I think is fundamental to how we then begin to change. I think there's a little link that happens there, which I think awareness breeds choice, and I think then choice breeds change. And I think so awareness of why am I attracted to the type of people I'm attracted to, or what is it that warms me to this type of person at work, for example. Maybe there's a certain type of colleague that I always desire to socialize with. Maybe there's a type of manager that always rubs me up the wrong way, right? And so but of course this is always about us, and that's the other thing with attachment, is this is about how I relate to myself, and this is about how I relate to my environment. This is not about other people. So and we can often think, oh, it's just because my manager is a what or whatever. Maybe I've got a difficult manager, or maybe my colleagues are just selfish. But actually, it's more than that. This is how I experience other people, and why do I react in the way that I react. So this is always about us, not other people. And awareness that there are certain types of people, for example, who elicit an anxiety in me. Well, it would be good to know that, wouldn't it?
Certainly. And I think that's kind of exactly like you say, that awareness, developing that awareness gives us the choice. And in, you know, engaging with things like this, reading up about attachment types and patterns, is the beginning of that awareness. And so I wonder, as maybe kind of like a summary hack, what would you say are kind of certain key things that we can notice, say in our working relationships, that would indicate particular types of attachment dynamics.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I made, if you don't mind, I was thinking about this question, so I made a few notes.
Yeah, please.
Just notes that I thought of in terms of what characteristics we might recognise in the workplace,
Mm,
not in the therapy environment, but specifically at work.
mm,
And maybe this is a time for me to hold my hand up a little bit as well, because I think personal experience matters a great deal. And I spent a long time in corporate life, and I was and can be occasionally still fairly anxious in my attachment.
mhm,
That's my early experience was one of growing up in a family where my needs weren't always taken into account. And so I grew up with a fairly anxious attachment. That I've had hundreds of hours of my own therapy up until this point, and so that's changed somewhat. But I can default back to that position when stressed, and so I've pulled out from my own experience how this can often play itself out in the corporate environment. So I made a few notes. So um, the secure person, I think I think, as I said before, they view themselves positively and they view others positively. Maybe that's a good place to start. And they feel able to be cared for, and they feel able to care for others. The next box I mentioned to you was the preoccupied or the anxious box, where anxiety is the predominant emotion. And I think these people who would fit into that category probably are best having jobs that are low in stress. But typically, there might be people who overthink and overanalyze conversations. They are hypersensitive to criticism and feedback. They may require a lot of praise and maybe some hand holding. They will feel preoccupied, there's that word again, with approval and acceptance, and may also have a strong desire for closeness and social relationships. They have negative expectations and perceptions of authority, and will often feel underappreciated. And maybe it's worth saying at this point as well that attachment position, that little box of the anxious, preoccupied position, really the fundamental belief of somebody in that position, albeit unconscious, we should say, is that it's a fear of abandonment or rejection. Hence, we can then lift that and now put that on the corporate thing and think, well, we can understand why somebody may be anxious about their position at work and whether they're in trouble, whether they're doing a good enough job, how people feel about them. For somebody who's fairly anxious like that, when the boss says, can we have a chat tomorrow, right? For somebody like that, that's going to be a whole load of worry between now and the meeting. I'm going to be in trouble. I've clearly done something wrong. That would be how somebody who's fairly anxious would play out at work.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're kind of thinking here really about this fear of rejection and abandonment, and kind of how that then plays out in these working dynamics. And actually, I think the word that you use, more preoccupied, is a very useful way to think about it, especially when we look at patterns like when there's a meeting coming up or a boss says, I want to talk to you about something.
Yeah.
Will then preoccupy someone's mind, and actually that's not useful. If we then are aware of that in our colleagues, or we're aware of that in ourselves, then we can either ask for someone to kind of not, I don't know, kind of to just be aware of that, and maybe kind of not necessarily, I mean, sometimes you do just need to say, well, I'll need to talk to you later.
Yeah.
But even a couple of words of reassurance to say, oh, I need to talk to you later, nothing serious, but just need to catch up, or a couple of details about what it is, to kind of stop someone's mind being so preoccupied with these ideas of what it could be. And similarly, if we're aware of that in ourselves as well, we can recognize, okay, I'm thinking about this because I'm concerned about rejection and abandonment.
Yeah.
I'm aware of that now. So now I can choose to try and occupy myself with something else, knowing that those thoughts aren't useful.
Yeah.
And, similarly, if we recognize that in somebody else that we're working with on a peer level, then, it might be not too costly to give someone a bit more reassurance every now and then. And over time, hopefully our behavior with them will enforce this same knowledge and sense of safety that, if I do want to talk or have a meeting, it's not because you're always in trouble or something like that.
Well, that's spot on, because there's another little bit of relationship thing that happens there. Because if the boss says we need to talk tomorrow, it's not up to the boss to reassure the person that it's going to be okay. It might be nice in a relationship point of view. Maybe that's why it would be also good for a boss, for example, to have a rough idea about how his employees attach. But this raises the really important point in attachment, which is about how we self-soothe. For the person who's in the anxious position, their fundamental view of the I and the other is generally that I'm not okay, but the other is okay, which is why they rely so heavily on other people. And so being aware of that means actually somebody who's anxious or preoccupied in their attachment should really learn some valuable skills about how to self-soothe and take care of themselves. And because the fact is we can't always rely on other people, can we? And it would be very good if other people aren't available to lean on, then we should be able to self-soothe and take care of ourselves. And knowing what and which is why I spend a lot of time with my clients on self-care and learning how to meditate, learning how to do mindfulness, knowing how to do grounding exercises and breathing exercises. All of these types of things, for somebody who's anxious or preoccupied in their attachment, these are skills that they should really have in their toolkit. So that when the boss says we need to meet tomorrow, and then everything in your nervous system goes, oh my God, being able to step back and think, okay, I've got no evidence that I'm in trouble here. This is probably just about what's happening in our project or whatever, right? Then being able to that awareness, of course, now breeds choice. And okay, I know what to do. I know I feel anxious, but I'm going to take care of this. I'm fine. We do full body scans. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to go through my meditation routine, and this is going to be okay.
I think that's really useful, kind of recognizing what skills and kind of practices we can develop in this sort of bottom up way as well as top down. So with the top down being this cognitive understanding of it, okay, if I know that I'm likely to experience this kind of anxiety around a meeting with a boss or kind of a lack of communication from a colleague, for example, then I can look for the evidence to say or recognize, what am I thinking has happened? Am I catastrophizing? Is this my worst nightmare? Am I particularly bringing into being the thing that I fear the most? And if so, what's the evidence to say that that's not the case? And actually, logically, what else might be an option? But then also from the bottom up, these kind of nervous system regulatory practices whereby we can kind of try and lengthen our exhales and connecting with our body and kind of notice how we're feeling, ground ourselves through our bodies and our senses more widely as well. And those can be really, really useful for kind of managing anxiety and difficult attachments at work. I wonder also, so we've talked a little bit about kind of preoccupied attachment traits here at work, and how might we recognize avoidant attachment traits at work and respond to those in ourselves and in others?
Yeah. So somebody who's avoidant, I would say. Do you remember I said with the preoccupied position that a fear of abandonment or rejection is the primary emotion. Fear is the predominant emotion for somebody who's avoidant, and I would say that they are probably suited to jobs that have or require fewer interpersonal skills, and they may often work better in isolation, and they might suit things rather than people. Engineers, for example, IT departments, I was an IT manager for a long time before I was a therapist. And if you want to see a fabulous group of men with autism and ADHD, well, go to an IT department, right? And there's a reason why some of those people are also fairly avoidant. They do very well with things rather than people. They are likely to be fairly negative emotionally rather than positive, and they may come across as distant and cold, and might avoid socialization, and will generally have a negative view of leadership. And the other thing maybe I should mention with these attachment types is it can be very tempting to view these positions as being negative. And I think that's a mistake because an enormous part of our population are preoccupied or dismissive in their attachment. And in well-suited roles and in well-suited relationships, there's nothing negative about these positions. Nobody likes to feel anxious, of course. Our experience of it is that it's a negative emotion. Nobody likes to feel, for the avoidant person, nobody likes to feel like there's nobody else on earth I can trust, and therefore the only person I can trust is me, and I'm going to withdraw. Nobody likes that either. Both of them are uncomfortable. But for the observer looking in, which is what we're talking about, I think it's a mistake to look at these as negative positions that need to be changed. We just need to make sure these people are suited to good roles. And because they both come with an enormous amount of strengths. There are jobs that are very, very well suited to people who are avoidant that we wouldn't want an anxious person to go anywhere near, and vice versa. And people who need to work in isolation, for example, an anxious person wouldn't be able to deal with that. So there are huge amounts of positive traits I think we shouldn't lose sight of when we talk about insecure attachments.
Certainly. And I think that is such a good point to highlight, because we can very easily polarize kind of insecure is bad and secure. Insecure is bad and secure is good. And actually, we're not looking at the nuance here that there's different situations when these traits are more useful and others when the traits of another attachment style will be more useful. Like, for example, kind of when we think about preoccupied or anxious attachment styles in the workplace, and people with those kinds of traits, because of this fear of rejection or abandonment, can actually have a real kind of hypervigilance and be very, very good at kind of detecting risk and deceit, or kind of and also having hypervigilance about their own weaknesses and kind of opportunities for development. And that's, while we want to also help someone to feel secure in their abilities, we can also notice that a lot of the time somebody who has a more preoccupied or anxious attachment traits will be much more likely to seek ways to improve themselves, because that will then enable them to feel more secure in their attachments with others, because of elevating their sense of self-worth. And similarly, kind of the people that are more aware of social dynamics and what others think of them can actually end up being incredibly useful for creating cohesive working dynamics, because they're much more likely to kind of go along with the group. And while those people may not, or may be less likely to develop into leaders, they are so important and integral for kind of maintaining positive group dynamics, because we do need people to kind of be able to take a step back and look at, actually, okay, what's the consensus here? Maintaining positive group dynamics and maintaining harmony within a group is, just as important as the output of that group, because it dictates what the output of that group is. And when we're thinking also about kind of avoidant attachment traits within the working environment, exactly as you say, being able to work on your own and not need so much reassurance or supervision can be extremely useful. And especially when we're now in an age of remote working so much more, that kind of focus can be really useful, you know, without the need for that reassurance and engagement with team members.
Yeah.
And kind of also thinking about it through the lens of these group dynamics, we do need certain people within those groups to then also kind of cut through the chatter and prioritize focusing on work rather than focusing on the interpersonal relationships. And so there's a lot of evidence to say that actually, in terms of an employee base and or team dynamics, we really do want to have kind of a mixture of those who are
we really do.
attached and insecurely attached as well.
Yeah, absolutely we do.
And so kind of we've talked a little bit already about like the pros and cons of each sort of attachment type at work. But I wonder with that kind of, are there particular traits or behaviors from kind of any attachment type that you would say can be particularly harmful or difficult that we can kind of make an effort to gain more awareness over?
Yeah. And I don't know about harmful, because like any of these things, I guess we're talking about a spectrum. Right? There are people who, just as an example, to use the preoccupied position, there are people who are very mildly preoccupied, right? And a lot of their experience is they spend it in the secure box, and they relate to people fabulously, and their relationship with themselves is good, and they relate to their environment securely. Maybe under periods of high stress, now they default to a more anxious or preoccupied position. So there are those very mild people. And then there are people who are chronically preoccupied, for example, who would find it very, very difficult to be in work environments where they don't feel liked, right? So I think so. I comes back to my previous point. I think that this is about people being well matched to their environment and well matched to the type of job that they have. You know, I had a client who spent 6 months of their time in a research base in the middle of the ice, right? That wouldn't suit somebody who was preoccupied in their attachment, but it suits an avoidant person very well. And funnily enough, they were also married to somebody who's very avoidant. And you think how can that relationship possibly work? Because you never see each other. Well, no, they didn't, and they came together. They came together once every 6 months or something, and actually it worked fabulously. So we can't just write off certain things as being harmful. It's all about the situation and the environment.
Absolutely. And I think that's also a really important point to kind of then reflect on what we see as normal. We can end up judging things that are outside of that as unhealthy, when actually those experiencing that, like in your example of kind of having a relationship where you maybe only see each other once every 6 months, you know, someone who has quite a closed idea of what kind of relationship dynamics are supposed to be like, or what a healthy relationship dynamic is, might think that is unhealthy, that's kind of, that's a, you know, a negative type of attachment, or it's an insecure attachment, therefore it's unhealthy. But actually, if all the individuals experience in that dynamic are happy, their needs are being met, and they're not suffering, then I think, you know, we should refrain from judgment really, and you know, not essentially place these things as harmful when actually they are just different from the norm. And I'm curious as well, kind of, because we've been talking about how these relationships show up at work generally, these traits show up at work generally, and I wonder kind of if we think specifically about leaders, so kind of CEOs and kind of exec team, what might be particularly useful to be aware of if you are in one of those senior positions and you're leading others, with regards to how your own attachment traits may affect your team, but also also how to kind of manage the attachment traits of your team if you recognize them.
Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it? I've been reminded of a book that I read several years ago, and I hope you've heard of it. But I think maybe it was called something like the psychopath test.
Oh yeah,
Something like that. And of course, the study that was done was recognizing how many CEOs of multinationals, for example, have very similar traits to those we find in psychopathy, right? So that's a good example as well. That there are some traits that we look at as being extremely negative and problematic, in certain situations become a real strength. So that drive of character and that need to succeed above all else. There are certain environments where there's a reason why people lead large companies, because they have some of those traits. But I think there are some things I can imagine that somebody in an executive position is unlikely to be anxious or preoccupied in their attachment, because I don't think you get to that type of position when you're consistently worried about how other people think of you and needing that reassurance all the time. I also think they're unlikely to be very avoidant or dismissive, because that type of person, they only trust themselves. For example, their relationship with their environment is problematic. I'm okay, but I can't really trust my environment, and I don't know how you delegate well, and I don't know how you allow others to lead those others underneath you. For example, your board. I don't know how do you allow your marketing director to do his thing when actually you would need to micromanage his position because you can't trust him. So I think there's an enormous amount of security that comes from being in a position like that, and I don't see it can be any other way, because the other positions in a leadership position like that, they are going to be problematic, and I think those attachment traits are going to be highlighted and amplified. And so I think people who struggle with attachment are far less likely, I think, to be in those executive positions, because they require a strength and a solidity and a consistency, right? And so I think my guess is the majority of people in leadership positions like that are fairly secure.
I think that's such a keen observation around what traits are necessary even to be a leader, and actually how a lot of the time, if we do have more insecure attachment traits, that those might act as a barrier to leadership. And so for anyone who is experiencing difficulty getting into leadership roles, or is in a leadership role but is struggling to kind of manage those dynamics and kind of delegate, but also feel confident in their own leadership and their own ideas, and really just developing this sense of trust in ourselves and in others, then it may be useful to have a look into attachment traits and how to respond to those in ourselves, because that can be a real key way to develop ourselves professionally. And I think, when we talk about, again, we mentioned this at the beginning and it's coming around again, when we talk about attachment traits, we often talk about them as kind of, if we're working on our attachment, we'll be thinking that we're working on our personal relationships. But actually, by gaining self-awareness around our attachment traits and working on them actively, then we're really going to be benefiting ourselves professionally as well.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win.
Well, it is, and being aware that you have different types of people in your team, I think matters. It makes all the difference in the world, because if you have some people that you recognise need more attention than other people, just being aware of that means you relate to them perhaps more kindly, or you put in a bit of extra effort. Whereas you may have the guy on the team who maybe he's a bit more avoidant. That's interesting. I did a faux pas, which is I automatically made the assumption that the avoidant person was a guy. Did you spot that? Right? Because they are often, and so you have a person on your team who's maybe a bit more avoidant, and they're happy to work in isolation. You can just leave them to get on with it. They don't need as much hand holding, right? And so awareness of how different people operate, you can give people what they need in your team, rather than the assumption, oh, this person's always knocking on my door. Why are they so needy, right? And we often think of people who are preoccupied or anxious as being a bit needy, which is a horrible pejorative term that we use for people. But awareness of these different types of character traits in different people, I think, makes all the difference in the world.
Absolutely. And I think that that's such an important point to make, really, that when we're developing the soft skills of management, leaders of any level, training and awareness around attachment traits
Mm,
is so key to developing those relationships and learning
mm,
how to manage.
yeah,
We often talk about kind of personalized management and kind of sensitive management, where we're responding to individuals' needs, but we often don't talk about attachment dynamics within that, and
mm,
actually that can be a real shortcut to understanding somebody's needs,
yeah,
and will be useful for their development, but also the development of the team
mm,
more widely. Um, and so,
yeah,
we've covered a handful of these points already in
mm.
terms of how we can help support others to develop more secure attachments. Um, and I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add on that kind of, what are the, if we notice that somebody that we are working with is displaying more insecure
Mm,
attachment traits. I mean, I would encourage us to think, okay, we don't necessarily need to change all of these.
mm, yeah,
They're serving purposes, and this is also someone's personality to a certain degree.
mm,
But if there's something that we're noticing is inhibiting someone or making their experience more difficult or making the experience of others more difficult, then what are some of the ways that we can support people to
mm,
develop more
yeah,
attachment traits?
yeah. I love that question, and I said to you before. I think that all we have as humans is conversation, and so I think the best thing we can do is encourage people to talk. And if I could give anybody a piece of advice in relationship with whoever it is talk and talk and talk and express your needs. You hit on this earlier on. Encouraging your team to express what they need is well. There's something magical that happens when we express our needs and when we vocalize our internal experience. Because attachment, you mentioned this earlier on about the bottom up thing and how we relate to our body. All of that experience is a right hemisphere experience. We have these two different hemispheres, don't we? And our logic and our reason and our speech and language, all of that stuff that's managed by the left hemisphere. Well, one of the best things we can do is all of our attachment experience and our nervous system experience, which is managed by our right hemisphere. We need to encourage the crosstalk between the hemispheres, and the way we do that is by vocalizing our inner experience. The right brain talking to the left brain. And so encouraging people to talk and express your needs and talk about your experience. I think one of the best things somebody who's feeling fairly anxious, for example, in a team, one of the best things they can do is vocalize that consistently. We have this thing where this is embarrassing and I feel ashamed or I feel like I'm the only one that's anxious here. And in a struggle to appear normal, we keep it all hidden. And I think one of the very best things we can do if we're looking to security is vocalizing our inner experience. Saying to your boss, I know you gave me this task, but I tell you what, I'm feeling so anxious, I feel like I could be sick, right? That might that might be one of the best things you can say to your boss.
Hmm.
Because then maybe he's got the opportunity now to say something like, well, what can I do to support you?
Absolutely.
Speaking about your experience, I can't. I would highlight that and underline that. Talk, talk, talk.
I could not agree more. And I also just wanted to mention here as well how, the flip side of that, when we don't talk about how we're feeling, often it can then be exaggerated in our
Mm,
minds, and we can kind of spiral much more easily. And also it means that then we're still trying to get these needs met. So it might be a need for security, or a need for control, or a need for safety, and or affiliation and connection, And if we don't vocalize and talk about actually what that need is, then we end up trying to attain it in some other indirect way, which is often, a waste of energy. It's not the most efficient way to address that need. But by virtue of kind of being embarrassed, as you said, and inhibited in expressing ourselves, then we can actually engage in behaviors that aren't useful for even attaining that sense of control, let's say. But actually are kind of misleading people as to what our needs really are, and then it doesn't equip them with the awareness and ability to respond effectively to our needs, which they may well be able to do and be very willing to do as well.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to what we spoke about earlier, isn't it? Is the awareness that as I express my needs, they're not always going to be met by other people. And they will be met some of the time, we hope. But what do we do with the times when somebody can't meet our needs? And that comes back to how we self-care and how we self-soothe, and back to the grounding exercises and the mindfulness and the self-care and all of that stuff. But it's also worth mentioning in how we express our needs. Remember, a person who's fairly avoidant or dismissive is unlikely to do that. The anxious person will do that a lot, but the avoidant person is more likely to say, well, I don't have any needs, and I certainly don't need anything from anybody else. I'm fine, thanks. So there's also an awareness there that even though that may feel like it, this is about, because of course an avoidant person begins with an avoidant relationship with themselves. So their relationship to their inner experience is compromised. And so it feels like, well, I don't have any needs, I'm fine. So there's a whole load of awareness there as well about, actually, maybe it feels like I don't, but maybe I'm going to start to experiment with vocalizing the bit I know about my inner experience. And whereas the anxious person will have that in spades, the avoidant person might struggle with that a bit. And so awareness of how these two people operate. There's also now the possibility for the manager, for example, she can say, she can know, I need to drag it out of this guy a bit more than I do with this person, right? And knowing that there are different ways that people relate. Also, because then of course it means you're less likely to think this person in my team is problematic and needy, and this guy I can't connect with at all, and just write it off as difficult employees.
Certainly. And I think, practices like that of checking in, managers can just check in when in any meeting and several times in a meeting. And it doesn't need to kind of be a whole separate exercise, but saying, and how are we feeling about that? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? How are you feeling about this upcoming task? And asking people directly, and especially asking those who we know might need a little bit more coaxing.
Yeah.
Can really help develop that skill and that awareness in themselves of, their own emotions and their own feelings, so that they're not avoiding that intimacy with themselves. But also it can help model for those who are, I suppose it gives also the space for those who are more likely to express their needs and to kind of ask for those needs to be met externally, to witness kind of what's going on in the internal lives of those that they may see as people who don't like them, or are kind of withdrawn and don't care, when actually being more aware of their internal life as well can ease the concerns or preoccupations of someone with that kind of attachment trait.
Yeah, that's spot on, because we can very easily assume that the avoidant person, for example, they're just not interested. They've got no investment in the company. They don't care about, but actually that's not the case at all. And so as you go around a meeting saying, okay, before we wrap up, how's everybody doing? What do you think about this task? And for the anxious person, you're likely to get them speaking for the next 20 minutes, right? And your awareness of why they do that is really important. But then you get to Jeff, who's avoidant, and you say to Jeff, well, what do you think about this project? And Jeff says, yeah, fine. Okay, yeah, and maybe there's an opportunity there to help. Being aware of Jeff's internal process enables you to give him something and to to coax something out of him. And in a sense, it gives you a bit, hypothetically, it gives you the opportunity to sit alongside him, put your arm around him for a second, and say, "This is going to be okay." What do you think about this project?
Absolutely, such useful advice there. We could talk and talk and talk, couldn't we? But there's so much to say on this topic, and but I think that we've covered, hopefully in summary at least, a lot of the areas that will give somebody an idea of how to recognize these kinds of attachment traits in the workplace, in themselves and in others, and how to respond to them. If there's, I'd like to also just mention, I'm aware that people haven't been so able to engage through the chat because I think we've been having some issues with streaming to LinkedIn. But we have shared the streaming link for YouTube, so hopefully someone has been able, those who wanted to kind of watch on LinkedIn have been able to watch through there. But I do apologize for kind of the lack of ability to engage this time round. But we'll share it far and wide so anyone can catch up afterwards, and feel free to engage in the comments kind of even after this is live, and we can still respond. Thank you so much, Steven. It's been such a pleasure and so interesting to talk to you. As I said, I could go on asking questions all day. But really appreciate your expertise and you taking the time to be with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. You are so welcome. Thank you.
All right. Catch you next week, everyone, where we will have another episode of Weekly Insights.